Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlor the blinds were drawn, and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess, the former putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire.
"Hark at the wind!"
Mr. White, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it.
"I'm listening."
His son, grimly surveying the board, stretched out his hand.
"Check."
"I should hardly think that he'd come tonight."
His hand, meanwhile, was poised over the board.
"Mate."
Here Mrs. White gently tut-tutted.
"Never mind, dear. Perhaps you'll win the next one."
Outside, the gate banged loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door, was heard condoling with the new arrival, a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage.
"Here he is, Sergeant Major Morris. Sergeant Major, my wife and son Herbert."
The sergeant major shook hands, and taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host got out whiskey. The evening proceeded amicably, and at the third glass Morris's eyes got brighter, and he began to talk, speaking of wild scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange peoples.
"I'd like to go to India myself, just to look around a bit, you know."
"Better where you are."
"Still, I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers. What was that you started telling me the other day, Morris? About a monkey's paw or something?"
"Nothing. Leastways, nothing worth hearing."
Monkey's paw?
Well, this is a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps.
His three listeners leaned forward eagerly.
To look at it, just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy.
He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously.
It had a spell put on it by an old fakir, a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it.
"Well, why don't you have 3, sir?"
The soldier regarded him in the way that middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth.
"I have."
As he said this, his blotchy face paled.
And did you really have 3 wishes granted?
"I did.
And has anybody else wished?"
The first man had his 3 wishes, yes. I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got them all."
"If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris. What do you keep it for?"
"Fancy, I suppose. I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale, some of them, and those who do think of anything want to try it first and pay me afterwards."
Mr. White eyed the sergeant major keenly, then finally asked,
"If you could have another 3 wishes, would you have them?"
I don't know. I don't know.
He took the paw and, dangling it between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off.
Better let it burn.
If you don't want it, Morris, give it to me.
I won't. I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again like a sensible man.
The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely.
How do you do it?
Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud. But I warn you of the consequences.
Sounds like Arabian Nights.
The good woman rose and began to set the supper.
Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me?
Her husband drew the talisman from pocket, and then all three burst into laughter, as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught White by the arm.
If you must wish, wish for something sensible.
Mr. White dropped it back in his pocket, and placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the three sat listening in an enthralled fashion to a second installment of the soldier's adventures in India. At the evening's end, White closed the door behind his guest.
If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he's been telling us, we shan't make much out of it.
Did you give him anything for it, Father?
A trifle. He didn't want it, but I made him take it. And he pressed me again to throw it away.
Likely. Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, father, to begin with? Then you can't be henpecked.
He darted round the table, pursued by the maligned Mrs. White, armed with an antimacassar. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously.
I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact. It seems to me I've got all I want.
If you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you? Well, wish for 200 pounds then. That'll just do it.
His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman and said distinctly,
I wish for 200 pounds.
Instantly came a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran toward him.
It moved. As I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake.
Well, I don't see the money, and I bet I never shall.
Herbert picked the monkey's paw up from the floor where his father had dropped it and placed it on the table.
It must have been your fancy, Father.
No. Never mind, though. There's no harm done. It gave me a shock all the same.
They sat down by the fire again while the two men finished their pipes. Outside the wind was higher than ever, and the old man started nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. A silence unusual and depressing settled upon all three, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the night. Herbert smiled.
I expect you'll find your cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed, and something horrible squatting on top of your wardrobe watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains.
He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire, and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that, with a little uneasy laugh, he felt on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, Herbert laughed at his fears. There was an air of prosaic wholesomeness about the room which it had lacked on the previous night.
I suppose all old soldiers are the same. The idea of our listening to such nonsense. How could wishes be granted in these days?
Morris said that things happened so naturally that you might, if you so wished, attribute it to coincidence.
Well, don't break into the money before I come back from work. I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, avaricious man, and we shall have to disown you.
His mother laughed, and following him to the door, watched him down the road, and returning to the breakfast table, was very happy at the expense of her husband's credulity. Later at dinner she predicted,
Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home.
I dare say, but for all that, the thing moved in my hand. That I'll swear to. Now, where's my beer?
You thought it did.
I say it did. There was no thought about it. I had just... What's the matter?
His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In mental connection with the 200 pounds, she noticed that the stranger was well dressed and wore a silk hat of glossy newness. At last the man flung open the gate and walked up the path. Mrs. White brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. He gazed at her furtively and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old lady apologized for the appearance of the room. She then waited patiently for him to broach his business, but he was at first strangely silent.
I was asked to call. I come from Ma and Megan's.
Is anything the matter? Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it?
There, Mother. Sit down and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir.
I'm sorry.
Oh, is he hurt?
Badly hurt. But he is not in any pain.
Oh, thank God. Thank God for that.
She broke off suddenly as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon her, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the other's averted face. She caught her breath, and turning to her slower-witted husband, laid her trembling old hand upon his. There was a long silence.
He was caught in the machinery.
Caught in the machinery? Yes.
White sat staring blankly out at the window, and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it as he had been wont to do in their old courting days, nearly 40 years before.
He was the only one left to us. It is hard.
The firm wished me to convey their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss. I beg that you understand I am only their servant and merely obeying orders.
There was no reply.
I was to say that Ma and Megan's disclaim all responsibility. They admit no liability at all. But in consideration of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation.
Mr. White dropped his wife's hand, and rising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words.
How much?
200 pounds.
Oh!
Unconscious of his wife's, the old man smiled faintly, put out his hands like a sightless man, and dropped, a senseless heap, to the floor. In the huge new cemetery some 2 miles distant, the old couple buried their dead, and came back to a house steeped in shadow and silence. It was all over so quickly that they remained in a state of expectation, as though of something else to happen, something which was to lighten this load, too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and expectation gave place to resignation. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long to weariness. One night the old man, waking suddenly, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and the sound of subdued weeping came from the window. He raised himself in bed and listened.
Come back. You will be cold.
It is colder for my son.
He dozed fitfully until a sudden wild cry from his wife awoke him with a start.
The paw! The monkey's paw!
Where? Where is it? What's the matter?
I want it. You've not destroyed it.
It's in the parlor on the bracket. Why?
I only just thought of it. Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?
Think of what?
The other 2 wishes. We've only had one.
Wasn't that enough?
No! We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly and wish our boy alive again.
Good God, you're mad.
Get it. Get it quickly and wish. Oh, my boy! My boy!
Her husband struck a match and lit the candle.
Get back to bed. You don't know what you're saying.
We had the first wish granted. Why not the second?
A coincidence.
Go and get it and wish!
The old man turned and regarded her.
He has been dead 10 days, and besides I would not tell you else, but I could only recognize him by his clothes. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how now?
Bring him back. Do you think I fear the child I have nursed?
He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the parlor. The talisman was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated son before him ere he could escape from the room seized upon him. His brow cold with sweat, he groped along the wall until he found himself in the small passage with the unwholesome thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was pale and expectant, and to his fears seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her.
Wish!
It is foolish and wicked.
Wish!
He raised his hand.
I wish my son alive again.
The talisman fell to the floor. Then he sank trembling into a chair as the old woman, with burning eyes, walked to the window and raised the blind. He sat until he was chilled with the cold, glancing at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, which had burned below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls, until, with a flicker larger than the rest, it expired. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back to his bed, and a minute or 2 afterward the old woman came silently and apathetically beside him. Neither spoke, but lay silently listening to the ticking of the clock. A stair creaked, and a squeaky mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time screwing up his courage, he took the box of matches and, striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs the match went out, and he paused to strike another, and at that same moment a knock, so quiet and stealthy as to be scarcely audible, sounded on the front door. The matches fell from his hand and spilled in the passage. He stood motionless, his breath suspended until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and fled swiftly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house.
What's that?
A rat. A rat! It passed me on the stairs.
His wife sat up in bed, listening. A loud knock resounded through the house.
Oh! It's Herbert!
What are you going to do?
It's my boy! It's Herbert! I forgot it was 2 miles away. Why are you holding me back? Let go! I must open the door!
For God's sake, don't let it in!
You're afraid of your own son. Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert! I'm coming!
The old woman, with a sudden wrench, broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the landing and called after her appealingly as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back and the bottom bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. Then the old woman's voice, strained and panting.
The bolt! Come down! I can't reach it!
But her husband was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If he could only find it before the thing outside got in. He heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put it down in the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same moment he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him courage to run down to her side and then to the gate beyond. A street lamp flickering opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road.